The greatest deception of the Trojan horse may have happened after the war was already over. That sounds backwards. For centuries, the horse has been remembered as the deception, the masterstroke, the legendary trick, the symbol of strategic genius. But what if that famous story is distracting us from a much larger question? Not whether the horse existed. Not whether it worked. But why this version of events survived while countless other possibilities vanished into silence. Imagine standing before the ruins of a civilization long after the last witness is gone. The city is gone. The arguments are gone. The doubts are gone. The people who disagreed with the official version are gone. All that remains is a story. And the longer that story survives, the more it begins to feel like reality itself. That is where the mystery begins. Because history has a habit that most people never think about. It remembers outcomes far better than processes. We remember victories. We rarely remember confusion. We remember monuments. We rarely remember the mistakes made before they were built. And when a story becomes powerful enough, something strange happens. The rough edges disappear. The contradictions fade. Complexity gives way to certainty. The Trojan horse sits at the center of one of the most famous victory narratives ever told. Yet the more iconic a symbol becomes, the harder it becomes to question. And that should make us uncomfortable. Think about it. Nearly every major operation in history, military, political, even technological, is filled with delays, disagreements, failed assumptions, unexpected consequences, and moments when everything nearly falls apart. Perfection is rare. Almost suspiciously rare. So why does the story of the horse often feel so complete? Why does it arrive in our memory like a finished sculpture rather than a messy human event? And more importantly, what might have been removed before the story reached us? This is where the forgotten figures become more interesting than the heroes themselves. Not because they won. Not because they changed the outcome. But because they represent something far more dangerous, alternative versions of reality. A warning. Nobody believed. A doubt nobody recorded. A question that survived only as an echo. Again and again, throughout history, the people who challenge dominant narratives face the same paradox. Being correct is not enough. Truth and influence are not the same thing. A warning can be accurate and still lose. An idea can be valid and still disappear. That may be the most important memory fragment hidden inside the Trojan horse. Not the giant wooden structure standing outside a city's walls. Not the image that appears in paintings, movies, and textbooks. But the possibility that somewhere behind that image stood competing stories that never reached us. Because once a civilization chooses a symbol, that symbol begins to shape memory itself. And that raises a much larger question. If the story we inherited is the one that survived, what happened to the versions that didn't? If stories naturally simplify the past, then we have to ask a difficult question: what kinds of details are usually lost first? The answer is rarely random. What disappears first is often uncertainty. The hesitation before a decision. The disagreement inside a leadership circle. The warning that sounded inconvenient at the time. The failed attempt that came before the celebrated success. These are the fragments history tends to shed as stories become cleaner, shorter, and easier to remember. And that creates a contradiction. The more famous a historical narrative becomes, the more likely it is that complexity has been stripped away from it. Not because someone sat down and invented a lie. Most of the time, something more subtle happens. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. We prefer stories with clear causes, clear heroes, and clear outcomes. Ambiguity is difficult to pass from one generation to the next. Simplicity survives. That may be why the Trojan horse became so powerful. Not merely as a strategy. As a symbol. A symbol is far more durable than an argument. Think about what the image represents. A giant wooden horse standing silently outside a city's walls. One object. One decision. One moment that supposedly explains everything that followed. It's elegant. Almost too elegant. Because real. Civilizations rarely rise or fall because of a single moment. Real history is usually the accumulation of pressures, misjudgments, rival interests, blind spots, and unintended consequences. Yet symbols compress all of that complexity into something the human mind can easily carry. And once a symbol takes hold, something fascinating begins to happen. People stop questioning what surrounds it. The symbol becomes the memory. The memory becomes the lesson. And eventually the lesson becomes accepted truth. That brings us to some of the most intriguing figures orbiting this story. Not the celebrated strategists. The ignored voices. Figures like Cassandra and Laocoon matter not because they changed the outcome, but because they represent a recurring pattern that stretches far beyond ancient mythology. Their role is not to be heroes. Their role is to embody a disturbing possibility that a society can encounter a warning and still move confidently in the wrong direction. That pattern appears everywhere. In politics. In business. In financial bubbles. In collapsing institutions. Again and again, warnings exist before consequences become visible. But warnings compete against something far more powerful than evidence. They compete against belief. And belief often has an advantage. Because belief offers certainty. Warnings offer discomfort. This is where the story begins to scale beyond Troy. What we're really examining is not an ancient city. It's a recurring human behavior. A civilization constructs a narrative about itself. That narrative becomes part of its identity. Over time, questioning the narrative starts to feel like questioning reality itself. The result can be dangerous. Not because the narrative is entirely false, but because it becomes incomplete. And incomplete stories create incomplete lessons. A burned city can become a memory fragment. A warning ignored can become a memory fragment. A missing chapter can become a memory fragment. But the most dangerous fragment of all may be the one we never realize is missing. Because if every generation inherits a version of the past that has already been edited, condensed, and polished, then the real question is no longer whether the famous story happened. The real question is this: what if the most important clue isn't hidden inside the story that survived, but inside the doubts, failures, and competing versions that disappeared before anyone thought to preserve them? But what if we are asking the wrong question entirely? Up to this point, we have been looking for missing details inside the story. Missing warnings. Missing perspectives. Missing versions of events. Yet there is another possibility that is even more unsettling. What if the greatest omission was not a fact? What if it was a pattern? Because when people hear the story of a brilliant deception, they usually focus on the strategist. They focus on intelligence, planning, and execution. The spotlight naturally falls on figures like Odysseus, the archetype of the clever architect who bends perception to achieve an outcome. But there is a contradiction hidden inside that admiration. History often celebrates the person who successfully changes perception. It rarely examines the conditions that made the deception possible in the first place. That distinction matters. Because a deception cannot succeed in a vacuum. It requires an audience. It requires assumptions. It requires people who are prepared to believe one version of reality rather than another. And suddenly the center of gravity shifts. The most important question is no longer, who created the illusion? The more important question becomes, why was the illusion accepted? That is where the crisis begins. Because once we move beyond individuals, we enter the realm of systems. And systems reveal uncomfortable truths. Consider the role of Cassandra. Her significance does not come from prediction alone. Her role is much larger than that. She represents a recurring contradiction in human civilization, truth without authority. Again and again, societies encounter voices that identify emerging dangers. Sometimes those voices are correct. Sometimes they are not. But the critical point is that accuracy alone does not determine influence. Influence follows trust. Trust follows narrative. And narrative often follows power. That creates a cycle. Power shapes narrative. Narrative shapes belief. Belief shapes decisions. Decisions shape history. Then history reinforces the original narrative. The cycle closes. This is no longer a story about a city. It becomes a story about civilization itself. And that escalation forces us to confront a difficult possibility. Perhaps the real lesson hidden beneath the symbol is not that deception is powerful. Most people already know that. Perhaps the deeper lesson is that societies are often structured in ways that make certain deceptions almost inevitable. Not because people are foolish. Because people need coherence. Human beings struggle to function inside endless uncertainty. We seek explanations. We seek order. We seek stories that transform chaos into meaning. That desire is one of humanity's greatest strengths. It may also be one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Now another memory fragment emerges. Not the wooden horse. Not the warning. But the empty space between them. The invisible gap where decisions are made. The place where uncertainty becomes belief. The place where belief becomes action. And once that gap enters the picture, another contradiction appears. The most influential events in history may not be driven by what people know. They may be driven by what people feel certain they know. Those are not the same thing. The consequences extend far beyond mythology. Financial manias. Political movements. Corporate collapses. National crises. Again and again, confidence often arrives before certainty. And certainty frequently arrives before evidence. The pattern repeats across centuries. Which raises an increasingly uncomfortable mystery. If the famous symbol survived because it offered a simple explanation for a complex reality, then what else disappeared alongside the complexity? More importantly, if civilizations repeatedly compress uncertainty into narrative, are we looking at an ancient myth? Or are we looking at a blueprint that human societies continue to follow to this day? And if that pattern is still operating now, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Who benefits when complexity disappears? The answer may be far less dramatic than a conspiracy and far more powerful than a deception. What benefits from the disappearance of complexity is not always a ruler, a government, or a victorious army. Sometimes what benefits is the story itself. This is the revelation that begins to change the entire shape of the discussion. We often assume that narratives exist to preserve information. In reality, many of the most enduring narratives survive because they reduce information. They transform a maze into a path. They transform uncertainty into meaning. They transform thousands of competing possibilities into a single memorable lesson. Suddenly the horse looks different. Not as a military object. Not even as a strategic innovation. It becomes a compression device. A symbol capable of carrying an entire civilization's memory inside a single image. That is why the symbol endured while countless details faded away. Human beings do not remember complexity very well. We remember stories. We remember images. We remember emotional patterns. A giant wooden horse outside a city's walls can survive for 3,000 years. 100 competing explanations cannot. That realization creates a deeper insight. The central conflict was never simply between opposing sides. The deeper conflict existed between reality and memory. Reality is dense. Memory is selective. Reality contains contradictions. Memory prefers coherence. Reality expands outward in all directions. Memory narrows until it becomes portable enough to carry into the future. This is why certain figures become increasingly important the closer we look. Odysseus is not merely the architect of a strategy. His deeper role is symbolic. He represents the power to shape perception. Yet even that role contains a hidden contradiction. The influence of perception does not end when an operation succeeds. Its greatest influence begins afterward, when future generations inherit the interpretation of what happened. Meanwhile, figures such as Cassandra occupy an entirely different symbolic space. Their legacy is not prediction. Their legacy is friction. They remind us that every dominant narrative once existed alongside alternatives. Possibilities competed. Interpretations competed. Futures competed. Then one version survived. Another memory fragment emerges here. Not a warning. Not a survivor. Not a burning city. Imagine instead an archive with missing shelves. Most people focus on the books that remain. Almost nobody stops to wonder which books vanished. The absence itself becomes evidence. And that absence carries consequences far beyond ancient mythology. Entire civilizations construct identities from inherited narratives. Institutions build legitimacy from inherited narratives. Individuals build meaning from inherited narratives. Once those narratives become foundational, questioning them can feel destabilizing. Not because the questions are wrong, but because the structure built upon them has become valuable. The scale now shifts once again. We are no longer examining how stories preserve civilizations. We are beginning to see how civilizations may be shaped by the stories they choose to preserve. And that leads us toward a far more unsettling revelation. What if the enduring symbol was never primarily designed to explain the fall of a city? What if its greatest historical function was to teach future generations how victory should be remembered? But if that is true, then we arrive at the deepest question in the entire discussion. What exactly survived through the centuries? Was it a record of an event? Or was it a lesson disguised as an event? This is the point where the symbol reveals its deepest function. The enduring image was never merely preserving memory. It was manufacturing meaning. That distinction changes everything. Most people assume history moves in a straight line from reality to record. Something happens, people remember it, and future generations inherit the memory. Yet the deeper pattern appears to work in the opposite direction. Human beings do not simply preserve the past. They reorganize the past into forms that help them navigate the future. Suddenly the central symbol becomes something much larger than a strategic device. It becomes a cultural operating system. A civilization-sized story about intelligence, trust, vulnerability, victory, and the consequences of misjudgment. This is the core revelation. The lasting power of the horse was never its ability to enter a city. Its lasting power was its ability to enter the imagination of future generations. That is why the symbol survived while countless details disappeared. Details explain what happened. Symbols explain what people believe happened. And belief often exerts greater influence than information. This realization transforms every major figure surrounding the narrative. Odysseus no longer represents merely a clever strategist. His deeper role becomes the embodiment of narrative leverage. He demonstrates that influence expands dramatically when an action becomes a story and a story becomes a model. Cassandra becomes something different as well. Her deepest significance is not prophecy. It is epistemology. She embodies the question of how societies determine what counts as credible knowledge. Her contradiction is timeless. Being right does not guarantee influence. Influence determines what becomes reality in the minds of others. Even the city itself changes meaning. It stops being a location and becomes a memory fragment. A civilization confronted with uncertainty. A community deciding which signals deserve trust. A society discovering that perception can shape destiny as powerfully as force ever could. The insight expands again. The symbol endured not because it explained one historical moment. It endured because every generation encounters its own version of the same dilemma. Which warning should be believed? Which authority should be trusted? Which narrative deserves loyalty? Which assumptions are invisible until consequences arrive? The scale now moves beyond mythology, beyond literature, beyond history. We are approaching something fundamental about human nature itself. Human beings cannot process infinite complexity. We require frameworks. We require symbols. We require narratives capable of transforming overwhelming reality into something understandable. That necessity creates civilization. Yet it also creates vulnerability. The same mechanism that allows societies to coordinate, cooperate, and preserve knowledge can also simplify reality until important truths disappear. Another memory fragment emerges. Not a horse. Not a city. Not an archive with missing shelves. Imagine a map that has been copied so many times that everyone forgets it was originally drawn by someone. The map becomes reality. The representation becomes the territory. And that leads directly to the consequence at the heart of this entire story. If civilizations inherit meaning through symbols rather than raw events, then the most powerful force shaping the future may not be what actually happened. It may be the version of what happened that people choose to remember. And if that is true, what are the long-term consequences when an entire civilization builds its understanding of itself upon narratives that are meaningful, memorable, and useful, but not necessarily complete? The consequence of all this is not that history becomes false. The consequence is something much more subtle and much more permanent. History becomes selective. And once selectivity becomes invisible, it begins to shape entire civilizations without being noticed. This is the legacy hidden beneath the symbol. Not a lesson about deception alone, but a lesson about inheritance. Every generation receives a collection of stories, symbols, assumptions, and remembered truths. Most people never choose that inheritance. They simply enter a world where it already exists. The consequence is that narratives become infrastructure. We usually think of infrastructure as roads, bridges, institutions, and laws. Yet civilizations also run on invisible infrastructure. Shared memories. Shared myths. Shared interpretations of the past. These determine what people trust, what they fear, what they admire, and what they consider possible. That is why the deepest legacy of the figures surrounding this story extends far beyond their original world. Odysseus becomes a symbol of strategic intelligence, but his larger influence is the normalization of narrative power itself. His legacy is the recognition that shaping perception can have effects that outlive any immediate outcome. Cassandra becomes equally important for a different reason. Her legacy is not the warning she gave. It is the recurring pattern she represents. Across centuries, societies continue to produce individuals who identify risks before those risks become obvious. Yet their influence depends not only on accuracy, but on whether the surrounding culture is capable of hearing them. This creates a profound psychological consequence. People often assume that knowledge protects them. In reality, knowledge without attention can disappear. Knowledge without credibility can disappear. Knowledge without narrative can disappear. That is one of the most enduring lessons hidden within the entire structure we have been exploring. Another memory fragment emerges. Imagine a room filled with maps. Some are detailed. Some are simplified. Some are incomplete. Over time, people stop comparing the maps to reality. They begin comparing reality to the maps. The map becomes the authority. The simplification becomes the standard. The consequence is not immediate. It unfolds across generations. The scale now expands beyond individual stories and enters the realm of collective psychology. Entire societies construct identities from remembered victories, remembered traumas, remembered warnings, and remembered heroes. Yet those memories are never neutral. They guide future decisions. They influence institutions. They shape education. They determine which questions feel natural to ask and which questions never arise at all. This is where legacy becomes particularly powerful. The most influential narratives are often not the ones people consciously believe. They are the ones people rarely think to question. Their influence operates beneath awareness, shaping expectations long before evidence enters the conversation. The result is a paradox. The stories that help civilization survive can also limit what civilizations are able to see. The narratives that provide stability can gradually reduce curiosity. The symbols that preserve meaning can eventually obscure complexity. And that leaves us with one final consequence that reaches beyond mythology, beyond history, and into the present moment. If every generation inherits a version of reality that has already been filtered through memory, symbolism, and narrative selection, then perhaps the greatest challenge is not discovering what people chose to remember. Perhaps the greater challenge is discovering what became invisible because remembering it was no longer useful. And if entire civilizations can be shaped by what they forget, what might be the most important forgotten thing still influencing us today without our awareness? In the end, the deepest value of this story may have nothing to do with proving what happened and everything to do with understanding what happens to us when we inherit the past. Not the past itself, but the version of it that reaches our hands. Because every generation stands in a similar position. We arrive long after the witnesses are gone. Long after the arguments have ended. Long after the uncertainty has disappeared. What remains are symbols. Fragments. Narratives. A wooden horse standing outside forgotten walls. A warning voice fading into silence. An archive with missing shelves. A map copied so many times that nobody remembers who drew the original lines. These images endure because they point toward something larger than any single civilization. They point toward the human condition itself. We often imagine that wisdom comes from collecting more information. Yet the older and deeper question may be whether we are capable of recognizing the limits of the information we already possess. There is a profound difference between knowledge and certainty. Knowledge expands. Certainty closes. Throughout this journey, the most important figures were never merely individuals. They became mirrors. The strategist reflects our fascination with influence. The ignored warning reflects our struggle to recognize uncomfortable truths. The survivor reflects the fragility of memory. Each role continues to exist because each role continues to exist within us. That is why stories like this remain alive long after their historical origins become difficult to separate from myth. Their real power is not historical. Their real power is psychological. They reveal recurring patterns in the way human beings create meaning. We search for order. We compress complexity. We transform confusion into narrative. We build identity from remembered symbols. And then, often without realizing it, we begin living inside the structures those symbols create. That realization carries both humility and responsibility. Humility, because no generation sees reality perfectly. Responsibility, because every generation decides which stories it will preserve, which assumptions it will challenge, and which questions it will continue asking. Perhaps that is the final legacy hidden beneath all of this. Not a lesson about the past, but a lesson about attention. About remaining aware that every inherited narrative contains both illumination and shadow. Every memory reveals something and conceals something. Every symbol preserves meaning while leaving something outside the frame. The challenge is not to reject stories. Human beings cannot live without them. The challenge is to remember that stories are bridges, not destinations. They help us approach reality, but they are never reality itself. And so we arrive at the image that remains after everything else has faded. Not a city. Not a victory. Not a defeat. Just a symbol standing at the boundary between memory and truth, reminding us that what survives is not always what mattered most, and what mattered most does not always survive. Perhaps that is why this question continues to echo across centuries. Not because we are still trying to understand an ancient world, but because we are still trying to understand ourselves. And if every civilization is ultimately shaped not only by what it remembers, but also by what it forgets, then how much of what we call truth today is simply the most successful memory that managed to survive?